Okay, so now we need to look at our finished work. And what I have here is the list of all the samples that we have completed. And what I'm going to do for the assessment is we're going to look at all the samples within each section. Go ahead and get this out, and then you'll be able to follow along with each of the samples as I go through and do the assessment. So the first one that we're going to start with, the first section is added fullness and details, and we're going to start with the straight dart. So here is the straight dart, and just before we begin, just remember that you need to have all of the information on your sample, the name of the sample, your name, and the date. And then that's the first thing that I would look at as an instructor. And then you also want to make sure that you've done the sample on the correct side. Now this is the straight dart, so the darts are going to be on the inside of the garment. The actual dart intake here is on the inside, and then the finished seam of the darts is on the outside. Now this isn't necessarily all of the case for darts. You can also find darts as a design detail where the excess is on the outside and then they've been stitched down, or it's just used as a design detail. And that's why this section is not just called added fullness, but it's also called design details. So let's first have a look at the outside of this straight dart. So what I'm going to first look for are all of the lengths of the darts even? And well, I can see right here on this one, it's a little bit shorter than the other two. So I might kind of do a little circle here. Now, one note about this, also being a design detail, is that not necessarily will all of your darts end at the same length. It depends on the design. For instance, some skirts, the dart closest to the side seam might be shorter than the innermost darts as a way to release fullness toward the hip. Another design detail is if this were a neckline and you had darts going from the center front all the way up to the shoulder, then the darts nearest the shoulder would be actually shorter because the fullness isn't needed toward the shoulder area, and then your shoulder seam is actually shorter. So the darts would be longer, graduated longer, as they start coming up to the bust where the fullness is actually needed. So we've looked at the length on the outside. So let's have a look at the inside. And again, I might, this is the one that was shorter. So I might also just kind of circle here on the inside. And I'm using a red pen, but I've also used red stitch thread so that you can actually see where my stitching was. So I want to look at the quality of the stitching, and the stitches look really nice. On this one here, I probably could have stitched just right, just a little bit closer here to the edge. And if we look, it leaves a little bit of a dimple there, so I may mark that. All in all, the quality of these darts, the stitching is pretty good. I've actually tied off the knots. I've left about an inch here or a little bit more, and then tied off so that they don't come out. That will save you some stress there. But the stitching here looks actually really good, and there's no double stitching here at the end, and all of my darts did pretty much end about a ½ inch past my drill mark, except for this one. I probably could have gone a little bit longer, but that could have been my fault because I may have mismarked the drill holes on the pattern. However, this is actually a pretty good sample. So let's move on to the fisheye dart. And again, we're looking at the outside. And now remember that it's not going to lay flat because on the inside, the largest part of the dart is actually at the center of the dart. And we could kind of look at this as maybe like a waistline. So this might be the waist. And then these darts might go down toward the hip, and these darts may go up toward the bust. But this is your waistline that is smaller than your bust and your hip area. So the outside looks good. It's nicely pressed. I've got all of my information here. Let's flip it to the inside. Let's quickly just look at the quality of the stitching. And the quality of the stitching looks good. I've ended at the appropriate places. I've got good stitching here at the ends, and also I'm 1/8 of an inch away from my drill holes. Everything is folded on the center drill hole line, and everything is pressed the proper way. Now I've chosen to press these away from each other, and that's just so that I can see the sample. But of course, in your garment, you will, for the design, you will have to refer to which way the darts should be pressed, because that may actually be a design detail. And again, these darts, even though these ones, the fullness or the intake is actually on the inside, we could also use them as a design detail and keep them on the outside and then stitch them down. This is actually looking a pretty good sample. So if your sample is stitched like this, you've got your ends of your threads tied in a knot so they don't get away from you. This all looks pretty good. So let's move on to the knife pleats. So here on this one, this is the outside again. So the intake of the pleat is on the inside. We'll look at that really quickly. Now, one thing about the pressing that I chose to do here, and that's just as an example. Some pleats may be pressed all the way down the length of the garment. Some pleats may only be pressed a certain length of way down, and then the rest is left open, and some may just not actually be pressed at all, just here at wherever they're attached to, and then it's left open. Okay, so that will be a design detail that you will need to refer to on the pattern card, or if you're the designer, you will need to actually state that the pleat should be pressed all the way down, especially if it's a pleated skirt and you want those pleats all the way down. If you're only pressing them a certain way down and they're not being stitched like our other sample, then you need to let them know that this is only stitched for so long down, and probably there might be added glue on the inside or on the outside to actually keep that pressed well. So we've got our stitching here to hold the knife pleats down. One thing that I would look at is how well did we match our notches. So that actually makes the pleat. So matching all of those notches actually makes the size of the pleat that we want. And of course, the inside will look very much like the outside, and just know that your quality of stitching is good there as well. So this is a very good sample. Now let's have a look at the stitched pleat. So now the stitched pleat does not have stitching on the outside. So it's a pleat that is actually stitched on the inside, as you recall, but it actually creates this pleating that actually, the stitched line actually holds the pleat in place. So you might also see these on skirts or even on the lower bottom part of a shirt, or maybe on a sleeve, which creates the fullness would create the fullness on the outside of the sleeve. So the lines look really good, they look even. My notches have been matched. So let's flip it to the inside. So again, I'm looking at the quality of the stitching. I've got a back stitch at each of the beginnings, and then I've got a back stitch here on at the end of our pleat here after we've pivoted. Now, one thing here is that you want to be sure that you are passing that width of the pleat drill hole, which is here, and also here, and here. And then you've gone the 1/4 inch past it and then pivoted over. So that's what I would be looking at, and how even all of these stitch widths look. All right. So again, the pleats, the extra fabric for the pleat is on the inside of the garment, and the outside is nice and clean. And again, I pressed this one here all the way down. This one I only pressed softly. And then this one, I actually didn't press at all. I left it open. So depending on the type of fabric or the look you're looking for. Now, if you want to keep these all the way pressed down, of course, there may be some sort of glue that goes on here on the inside, and that's something that you would need to actually call out on your design details, how you want it to be pressed and finished. But this is actually a very good looking sample. So let's have a look at the standard box pleat here. So again, the standard box pleat is with the pleat where the pleats fold away from each other, right? And I'm going to be looking to make sure that I'm matching all of those clipped notches. So all of those are matched on both of them. That looks good. And then what I would actually look at, the next thing, is that I would flip this over to the inside, and I'm going to look at how closely that I've kept these pieces, these folds of the pleat on the inside. Okay, I've got my notches all matched up here. Everything is perfect here. But sometimes in the sewing, these can actually get moved away from each other, and we don't want that because it will actually change the size of the pleat. Okay, so the pleat here is actually folding away from that notch, and that's what we want for the standard. Now, I didn't press this very evenly all the way down, so I may put a couple marks right there just to say that I think, if you look under here, my folding, if you look at the lines, are a little bit off. That's right, they're not even. So I just put a couple marks there, and maybe those can actually be repressed. This is if we want the box pleat to be pressed all of the way down. And then this one I didn't really press. I made sure that the fabric was pressed, but I didn't press it flat because I wanted to know that I have that option. And again, you'll need to note that in the details in the pattern card. So let's move on to the inverted box pleat, which is the opposite folding. And let me just go ahead and bring this standard box pleat in here. See where the fold of the pleat folds away from each other. And then here, the fold of the pleat matches each other. So this is your inverted box pleat, and this is your standard box pleat. So if you want to think of it, the pleat fabric is actually folding on the outside of the garment, whereas the inverted box pleat is folding to the inside of the garment. And again, we're looking for the same type of stitching details. I've got good stitching here that's going to hold this together. And instead of having to move to the inside of the garment to see how close I've got those folds together, I can see it right here on the outside. Now, if you have a waistband going on here, you're going to make sure that these stay really tight together because, again, you're going to be running another stitch line here with fabric over it, which also might kind of separate that. So you may want to just take another stitch like right across there, just a long basting stitch, to hold those in place while you're stitching your waistband on, and then you can pull those stitches out when you're done with installing the waistband. And again, I've got this one pressed flat all the way down, and this one I've just kind of softly pressed just so I could see that I have that option, that I don't necessarily have to have a hard press. And of course, that will depend on your design and your fabric. And I'm going to look at the inside and how even everything looks. This one looks a little bit more even than the standard, but all in all, this is also a good sample. So let's move on to our tucks, and I have several different widths of tucks here. We can look at all of these at the same time. So there are 4 different sizes. Let me make sure I can get all of these in the camera. Lined up here, smallest to largest. So this is my 1/8, this is my 1/4, 3/8, and 1/2. So the difference between tucks and pleats is that tucks are on the outside of the garment. So if we look at the inside, we all have basically stitch lines. So the outside of the garment, we actually see the stitching and we see the excess of that pleat, which is folded to create a design interest on the outside of a garment. And these can go anywhere: on a shirt, on a collar, on a sleeve, on a skirt, on a dress. Use tucks. Tucks are a lot of fun to play with. So what am I looking for? Just like everything else on like our seams, going back to the level 1, is I'm actually looking at stitch quality first. So I'm going to look at the quality of the stitching, and I'm going to kind of fold this to look at the underside to make sure that both sides of the stitching have really good quality, and they do. All of these do. Just kind of peeking under here really quickly. The other thing I want to do is I want to make sure that all of the notches have been matched properly, right? Because that's where I know for sure I'm getting that width of that tuck that I want. Now again, these tucks will measure the finished width when they're folded. This is 1/8 from the stitching, 1/4 inch from the stitching, 3/8 from the stitching, and then 1/2 inch from the stitching to the folded edge. So the actual width of the fabric on the pattern for this one is 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch, 3/4 inch, and 1 inch. But the finished tuck size is actually half of that measurement. So that's what I would also be looking at, and I would measure each one of these to make sure I'm getting each one of those widths correct. So accuracy is really important in sewing, and if I have one of these 1/2 inches that is off just a little bit, it's going to be really noticeable. On here, I can see that I'm a little weird right up here on this section right here, because I can see there's a clear difference between the distance between the two. So that doesn't necessarily mean that I've stitched more than 1/2 inch. I may have crooked stitching, but actually up here it may look like that it's slightly off. So I might just point that out. And then also here, this one actually looks pretty good, and so does the 1/4 and the 1/8. So all in all, these are pretty good samples. You may just want to check this one over and make sure that you didn't go slightly over as you stitch further out, and then it looks like it came back. Okay, so just make sure that all of your widths are even. But the stitching on this looks really good. So what do we have next? We have our release tucks. And these are, again, these are tucks. They look like pleats. In fact, they're sewn very similarly to the stitched pleat, right? Except this is on the outside of the garment. I know that because I've marked my face side of the garment here. And of course, the inside is here. So the difference between this and the stitched pleat, even though it's on the outside, is that I'm not stitching across here. You could do that if you wanted to as a design detail, but it's really not necessary. So I'm looking at the stitch quality, pretty good. I'm a little weird there, it kind of bows a little bit, and then I come back here into the width here. But I'm going to look at the inside. They're pretty evenly spaced. It's easier to kind of look at these seams. They're pretty evenly spaced, so that's good. Now I've chosen to kind of press these different ways. I have two going this way and one going this other way. I just pressed that so I could remind myself that I can actually have these pressed any way I want. But you're going to need to make sure, since these are on the outside of the garment, that you mention that in the pattern details on the pattern card. So this pleat I've pressed all the way down, and these two I've left soft. And so it creates kind of a different look for the garment. Again, these are release tucks, and the reason they're released is because we only sew them down a certain length. So this would be great, say, if you wanted kind of a flutter hem to a top, then you would do these stitched pleats between the under bust and the top and the end of the waist. And then this would be like a flutter around. So that would be a great design detail. And then also deciding which way you want these to be pressed. The inside looks good and the outside looks great. We may just want to look at that for a stitching detail. All in all, a good sample. So the next sample is almost the same thing. Also, these are graduated stitched tucks or release tucks. And the reason I've done this is because I just wanted to show how release tucks can be used as a design detail. So imagine this on a blouse going from the outside to the inside. It would make a really nice detail. Of course, if they were closer together or I stuck a couple here in the middle, that would be a really nice detail. So, or if this were the top of the sleeve at the shoulder, and then you had gradual release tucks going to the underarm, that would make a really nice flutter sleeve. So again, I'm looking at the stitch quality. Stitch quality is good. I've got back stitches. I didn't really press anything down. I wanted to keep it nice and soft. My notches are all matched up here. And the inside looks great. Everything is pressed really well, and these are nicely have a nice graduated release tuck here. So that's a great sample. So the last one we're going to look at is the one that actually required the most work. And this is the gathers or shearing. And we're going to call this a yoke, although it could be the top of a dress or a top of a shirt. And this was actually, we were working on our gathering skills. And I'm gonna first look at the outside of this. It's gonna be easier to look how even are these gathers, and they look fairly even, pretty even. I might put a little circle there. They seem to have a little less gathering going on there, shearing going on there. Gathering and shearing we kind of use interchangeably, although you should understand that gathering tends to be a little bit looser and then shearing tends to be a little bit tighter. So that all actually looks pretty good. And then what I'm going to look at this hem. Remember, we did that first. The stitching on that looks really great. And I'm going to turn this to the inside, and I'm going to look at the stitching here to see that it actually is pretty good all the way at that edge. And I'm maintaining that 1/4 inch rolled hem. And I've actually turned it here on the notch. And I've got everything stitched well. Stitching here, you can see I've left one of my lines of gathering stitches in here. That's fine. And I left that in there just so a reminder of where that gathering stitch was. But remember, we did one on the inside of the seam allowance, one at the seam line, and then one outside, and then we took it apart. So this is a good sample. I really like how the gathering happened here. I did not overlock this edge. And the reason I chose not to overlock this edge is because I wanted to be able to see this cut edge just in case there were any errors, anything that I needed to point out or remind myself about. And so when I was teaching in the classroom, I wouldn't let my students overlock this edge because I wanted to see. Not only that, but if you're not really great at overlocking and you accidentally cut extra off, then you will not have a standard 1/2 inch seam allowance. And I would actually look at that, and if I didn't have a good 1/2 inch seam allowance all the way around, then I would take points off for that. But this has a good 1/2 inch seam allowance. I didn't cut anything off with the overlock. So I'm going to turn this around, and this is a really great sample. If you've gotten this sample like this, you've done really great work.